How does an ancient story of a desperate king, a tattered kingdom, and a band of barons who dared to resist relate to you? This is the first chapter in America's origin story. Hey everybody, welcome to Storybounders. I am your host Jamie, and I'm here to help you find stories to love and believe in. If you haven't experienced our Storybounders podcast before, then I encourage you to listen to our first season on Spotify, Apple, or right here on YouTube. At the very least, you'll want to listen to our first episode about story reservoirs, because it will help you understand why story reservoirs are so important and why we feel like it's our mission to help our listeners fill their reservoir with good stories. There are hundreds of inspiring, impactful stories that we could share with you. But this 2026 season, we're focusing on the stories, music, poetry, movies, and literature that tell the story of America as we celebrate the 250th birthday of our independence this year. Our goal is to help you fill your reservoir with stories that will bring hope, inspiration, and anticipation for the future, as well as strength, comfort, healing, and courage to live your best life. Before we begin with our story for today, we have some really important housekeeping items to take care of. We believe so strongly in the following ideas that we'll repeat them during the next few episodes so that everyone will have a chance to hear it. Although I've been aware of the idea of presentism for a few years now, I just came across an Instagrammer, Tom Fitzgerald, who explained it so perfectly that I had to use it here. Your ability to understand presentism and not fall prey to it will help you have a much more enriching and life-changing experience with stories from history. So what is presentism? Presentism is when we take modern laws and modern moral values and we project them backwards onto a people who lived in a totally different world. It is one of the fastest ways to misunderstand and misjudge a historical event or person. So let's use Tom Fitzgerald's example of King Henry V. If King Henry lived today and claimed that God told him to go invade France and started taking land by force, we would call it a war crime. No question. But Henry didn't live today. He lived in the 1400s. And back then, a king's job description practically included waging war, expanding their kingdom by conquest, and defending dynastic claims. This wasn't extreme. It wasn't fringy. It wasn't arrogant. It was expected. Legitimacy came from lineage, divine favor, and success in battle. If a king didn't fight, he wasn't praised as being peaceful. He was seen as weak, and weakness invited rebellion or invasion. War and conquest weren't a rare exception in the system. It was the political system. In our modern day, we don't have to approve of it. Understanding is not the same thing as endorsing. When we judge the past only by our standards, we flatten it. We remove the context. We miss the point, and then we don't learn anything. Instead of asking, were they good or bad by my rules or today's rules, try asking, what rules were they living under and how well did they live by them? Every age has its own virtues and moral code, as well as challenges and pressures. And ignoring that does not make us morally superior, it just makes us historically illiterate. Now, here is the bottom line. The past isn't a mirror meant to reflect our day. It's a foreign country with its own laws and rules. And if we walk into that, demanding that everyone think like we do, we won't understand anything that we're seeing. and we lose an opportunity to have our minds and our hearts expanded with a deeper understanding of the world around us. So this is why we spend so much time giving you, the listener, context to the story that we're sharing in each episode. Context means everything when you are trying to truly experience a person or historical moment in time. We cannot fairly judge or learn from a story that we haven't taken the time to understand. So in this light, the story behind the story can be just as important as the story itself. So thank you again to Tom Fitzgerald for explaining this idea so well. You can find him on Instagram, so go give him a follow. He is an amazing storyteller and historian. So just one more note before we begin. Unfortunately, in recent years, Hollywood and even some historians, politicians, and educators have made it a habit to rewrite history. We are changing history to fit our modern expectations and sensitivities. We are falling prey to the sin of presentism in our own entertainment and even our very own history books. When we don't like parts of history because they're distasteful or uncomfortable, we make up our own version that's more acceptable to our palate. To quote one last time from Tom Fitzgerald's Instagram video, history doesn't need to be modernized, it just needs to be told properly. And as the posterity of this history, we owe our ancestors and those who came before us the respect and kindness to take time to learn about who they were and where they were coming from, rather than executing rash judgment and then writing them out of their own stories. As we share our version of the story of America, we sincerely hope that it will be enlightening and inspiring and help broaden our understanding and exposure to the beautifully complex layers that are held within her short story. Our country is diverse in landscape, in culture, and people, and it has been since the beginning. Even the original 13 colonies divided themselves in such a way to accommodate various personalities, customs, and religious preferences. From the very beginning, long before anyone had any ideas about creating a united nation, the shores of the New World were a magnet for rugged, strong-willed, stubborn-minded, do-it-yourself types of people, as well as those seeking refuge and sanctuary. And that has remained the core identity of America ever since. While this personality trait can have its downside, it is at the very heart of what brought the wilderness of the New World out of obscurity and into the spotlight of the entire world. You will see variants of this temperament, this identity, throughout many of the stories that we share, and how the American spirit, that rugged, dogged, can-do attitude, pervades every heart. It is what made and makes America great. So, how do you tell the story of America? Like, where do you start when telling America's story? There are a few places in time that would make sense, but if you know me at all, then you know that I love to give as much depth and context to a story as possible. So I'm going to start way back in 13th century England. And if you feel like that's a little bit crazy, then let me tell you, I probably could have started even further back. Well, I probably could have started with the creation of mankind, but I think that actually might be a little bit extra even for me. So, 13th century England it is. I have a feeling that some of you are probably a little bit nervous that this is going to be like your 10th grade history class, that you hated. But just remember that this is just a story, and it's a good enough story to be considered worthy of your story reservoir. So, open your minds and your hearts a little wider, and we'll begin. Here's the story behind the story. 14th century England held an ancient story close to its heart. They didn't get this story from books because so few of them could read, and books weren't something that people had at the time. But they learned this story by telling it again and again, generation after generation, until the words were written on their hearts. With customs and traditions passed from father to son, neighbor to neighbor, village to village, the strains became so familiar that no one bothered to write it down. To medieval England, law was not an invention. It was an ancient story of birthright. There was a shared understanding that the king ruled under the law, not above it. That belief was old. Older than castles rising from green hillsides. Older than Norman banners snapping in the wind. Older even than the English language they spoke to each other every day. It reached back to a time before conquest, before foreign kings crossed the sea and claimed England by force, back to a golden age, under the reign of Edward the Confessor, whose name had become shorthand for just rule. The law lived in tradition and custom. It lived in the expectation that land and property could not be seized without cause, that man could seek fair treatment and justice before judgment, that he could not be punished on a whim, and that man would not be unfairly or unduly taxed. These were not written rules. They were understood truths, fragile, human, and deeply held. By the year 1215, many believed these natural-born liberties and rights were slipping through their fingers. The crown rested on the head of a man who ruled with suspicion rather than trust, with calculation rather than conscience. By his order, royal messengers policed the roads more often now, carrying demands instead of protection. The courts, once places of careful judgment, had become unpredictable. Sometimes fair, sometimes ruinous, and always expensive. The law became fear itself. For the people of England, this was not simply political turmoil. It was a threat to their very survival. If the king could heavily tax the people on a whim, if he could take property without trial, if he could imprison without judgment, if he could break oaths sworn before God, then what was left to protect the people from ruin, loss of freedom, or even death? This social and political change greatly alarmed England's barons, wealthy men of status and title, who believed that the king's authority flowed from his willingness to uphold this ancient order, and they believed that order was unraveling. The barons, who would soon gather on a quiet, unassuming meadow by the Thames, did not see themselves as rebels seeking to tear down a system. They believed they were saving it, holding it upright as it buckled. They were not imagining a new world. They were fighting for an old one, where oaths were sacred and binding, where power had limits, where judicial customs were upheld, where the law was something even a king had to obey. As the king continued to operate as though it was his right to grant life and liberty, often terrorizing and crushing his subjects, and his people continued to fiercely cling to their ancient story of justice and limited power, the country was destined to clash in a violent and bloody event, which makes this moment in history so remarkable, as the tempest and turmoil converged on a quiet, grassy place between a river and a road, a place where, for the first time in European history, a king would be peacefully forced to stop. Now, here's the story. The king was King John of England, youngest son of a powerful dynasty, clever, suspicious, sharp-tongued, and profoundly insecure. John had not been raised to rule. He had grown up in the shadow of brothers who were larger than life, men shaped for command, admired on battlefields, and in majestic courts. John was the spare, the afterthought, the son given scraps of land and low expectations. Even as a boy, he learned that power was something you seized, not something freely given. So when the crown fell to him after the deaths of his older brothers, most famously Richard the Lionheart, he was not prepared. Richard had been a warrior king who loved the glory of a victorious crusade. These conquests made him absent from England more than present, but he left behind something John never managed to earn: celebrity status and prestige. The country had forgiven Richard's heavy taxes because he just seemed so heroic and had a righteous cause. John inherited none of that affection. What he inherited instead was debt, fragile borders, and expectations that he just could not meet. Early in his reign, John lost lands in France to King Philip II. Normandy, ancestral land, a source of wealth and proof of royal legitimacy, was gone. For generations, English kings have been lords of both sides of the English Channel, France and England. John became the king who let it slip away. The loss cut him deeply, personally, politically, and symbolically, and it left him desperate. Wars had to be funded, alliances bought, mercenaries paid, ships built, and every failure demanded another attempt, and every attempt demanded money. And so John turned to the barons, and at first they paid. That was their duty. They had always paid. Feudal life was built on obligation, land in exchange for loyalty, service in exchange for protection. But under John, obligation began to feel like exploitation. Taxes became heavier and more frequent. A man might be punished not for what he had done, but what for the king needed. Justice became something that could be negotiated, delayed, or sold outright. If John wanted your land, he would invent a reason. If he wanted leverage, he would take your son as a hostage. If he wanted silence, he would threaten ruin. The courts, once places of respectable justice, became tools for raising money. The law was bent, then bowed, then completely reshaped around the king's financial needs. And the king was watching, always watching. He distrusted everyone. He obsessively kept records of who hesitated, who questioned, or who spoke out of turn. Loyalty, once broken, was never forgiven. Even obedience was suspect, because it might simply be a facade for fracturing allegiance to the king. The barons who bore the brunt of John's bad behavior were not idealists. They were powerful men protecting their own interests. They did not dream of liberty for all people. They did not imagine equality or democracy or a future republic across the sea. But they understood something essential. Kings were meant to rule within limits. A king was meant to be strong and fearless, but also honorable and fair. A king was stationed above ordinary men in his sacred calling, but not above the law itself. A king was to be governed by restraint, and John showed none. Slowly, trust drained out of the realm. Meetings grew tense, and words had to be carefully chosen. Oaths, once spoken with confidence, were now cautiously uttered. Taxes and fees were dutifully paid, but the barons no longer believed the payments would ever be enough. While trust was slowly ebbing away, John revived an ancient practice of taking hostages. Historically, a strategy for guaranteeing allegiance and loyalty, John now used it for creating terror in barons who hesitated to bow to his demands. Those who hesitated to pay fines or taxes were ordered to surrender their sons and daughters, and these children were kept in royal custody, sometimes for years. Their safety depended entirely on continued obedience. This was psychological war. Every demand now carried an unspoken threat: comply or lose what you love most. One baron's fate came to symbolize everything that was wrong about King John's reign. William de Braos was once among King John's favorites, a powerful lord trusted with lands along the Welsh border. But like many who had a close relationship with John, favor turned to suspicion, and suspicion turned to vengeance. John accused de Braos of owing massive feudal debts, sums so large they could never realistically be paid. When de Braos' wife, Matilda, spoke openly and perhaps a little recklessly about John's rumored role in the murder of his own nephew, the king acted swiftly. He seized their lands, then he seized their family. Matilda and her eldest son were imprisoned in a royal castle. There was no trial, no judgment by jury, no sentence pronounced. They were locked in a room and left to starve. When their bodies were later found, it was said the boy had died sitting upright on a bench with his head tilted towards the wall. His mother, who had to watch him die, was so desperate in her hunger that she ate his cheeks. She was found dead, sitting on the floor between her son's legs. A brutal and grisly end for two innocent people. John had betrayed his subjects with such cruelty. Every English king swore a coronation oath to uphold justice, preserve ancient customs, and protect the realm. These were not symbolic promises. They were sacred, spoken before God, the church, and the people. When John ignored them again and again, he was not merely a harsh ruler. He was an oath breaker. And according to medieval custom, there were few crimes more horribly offensive and evil than that. But John wasn't just harassing his subjects, he also quarreled with the Pope over who should be Archbishop of Canterbury. The dispute might have seemed distant at first, a clash between powerful men far above ordinary life, but its consequences eventually affected everyone. The Pope placed England under an interdict, meaning the church withdrew sacraments, burials, and other services from the churches. Almost overnight, the spiritual customs of daily life vanished. In villages across England, church doors were shut and barred. Young couples stood outside silent chapels on what should have been their wedding day. No bells rang. No priest stepped forward. Their union, so essential to property, inheritance, and legitimacy, was postponed indefinitely. Their future suspended by a quarrel between king and pope. In another town, a family carried their dead to the churchyard only to be turned away. The dead were buried in unconsecrated ground with no prayers spoken over the body, leaving the living to wonder what fate awaited their loved one's soul that they had just laid in the earth. Without the sacraments, salvation itself felt uncertain. It was as though heaven had closed its doors, its favor withdrawn. Mothers and fathers whispered prayers at night. Priests wept privately. The land felt cursed, and still the king did not yield. When John finally did attempt to reconcile with the Pope, he submitted the entire country of England itself. John declared England a state of the Pope, placing the crown beneath papal authority and agreeing to pay annual tribute. It was an act meant to secure John's position, but to many it was betrayal. And for the barons, this was unforgivable. They had paid the king's taxes, endured his harassment, swallowed his humiliations. But now England itself, its independence, its dignity, its identity, had been handed over as a bargaining chip. One chronicler wrote that men groaned openly when they heard the news. To them, it felt as though the king had not only broken faith with his people, but with the country's very soul. And there were quieter wounds, too. Local officials found themselves torn between obedience to the king and loyalty to the church. Sheriffs enforced royal commands that contradicted spiritual authority. Religious leaders were imprisoned. Families watched neighbors turn on one another, not out of malice, but fear. Fear of punishment, fear of damnation, fear that no authority could be trusted anymore. The old order, the delicate balance between crown and church and custom, was crumbling. By the time King John returned from his final failed campaign in France, England was completely unhinged. The king had failed militarily. He had failed legally. He had failed spiritually. And now, in the eyes of many, he had humiliated the country itself. This was no longer about taxes or titles. It was about whether England still had some semblance of its former identity, if its people could even recognize their own home anymore. In the year 1214, King John launched one last desperate attempt to reclaim his French lands. It failed completely, ending any illusion that England's old glory and power could be recovered. When John crossed the Channel and returned home, the barons were waiting. They did not come shouting revolution. They did not gather in chaos or rage. They came armed with custom, precedent, and lawmen who believed that what they were about to do was not treason, but correction. They called themselves not rebels, but defenders of the liberties of England. At their head stood Robert Fitzwalter, a seasoned nobleman, fierce, resolute, and deeply wronged by the king. Before he became the leader of the resistance, Robert had been a loyal and powerful noble, deeply engaged in the life of the royal court. But John trusted no one for long, and suspicion followed even his most faithful servants. Fitzwalter found himself, his lands, and his family increasingly vulnerable to a king who had no limits to his cruelty. When Fitzwalter believed he was no longer safe, he fled into exile, a desperate act that marked him instantly as suspect. John responded without restraint. Fitzwalter's estates were seized without trial or judgment, his loyalty erased by royal decree. There was no clear crime, no opportunity for defense, only punishment. To England's barons, this was chilling proof that ancient custom no longer protected them. If a man of Fitzwalter's standing could be stripped of land and security at the king's whim, then no one was safe. Law, it seemed, had become a weapon in the king's hands rather than a shield for his people. When Fitzwalter returned, he came back changed. He no longer believed that loyalty alone could restrain power. His suffering had taught him that law without enforcement was fragile, and that when a king refused to be bound, restraint had to be imposed. As head of the barons' resistance, he took a title that was both defiant and deliberate: Marshal of the Army of God and of Holy Church. The barons openly renounced their allegiance. In the medieval world, allegiance was sacred, binding lord and man before God. Renouncing it meant that if the king prevailed, they would be traitors. stripped of lands, titles, and lives. They knew the danger, the cost, and they accepted it. Civil war loomed before them. The city of London was the beating heart of the kingdom, its wealth, its trade, its influence. London had suffered under John's rule as deeply as the barons had. Merchants had been taxed without mercy. Courts had interfered with commerce. Trust had eroded. At dawn, Robert Fitzwalter and the barons rode toward London with the weight of a kingdom pressing on their chests. This was the moment from which there would be no return. If the gates of the city stayed shut, their resistance would be considered traitorous and possibly turn into a bloody campaign for their own lives. Anxiously, the barons approached the city gate. Robert dismounted his horse when he heard the bells begin to stir, not in alarm, but in recognition. Then, slowly but decisively, the gates were opened. London had chosen. The city's militia stood aside as the barons entered the city. Years of unjust and merciless treatment had brought London to this threshold, and Fitzwalter felt the city breathe a collective sigh of relief. And as he moved through the streets, he understood the truth of the moment. England had found its courage, and the king would have to listen. With London lost, the balance shifted. The symbolic center of John's royal authority was gone. Most devastating of all, neutral barons, men who had hesitated, waited, and hoped for compromise, now saw the truth. This was no longer a precarious uprising. This was a powerful movement. Men rode in from the countryside to join Fitzwalter's banner. The king's authority, once absolute, began to feel hollow. John still had soldiers and castles and allies, but he no longer had legitimacy. And in medieval politics, legitimacy was everything. Furious, King John had no choice but to negotiate. He sent word that there would be a meeting, not in a palace, not in a cathedral, but on neutral ground, between armed camps, on a quiet meadow beside the Thames. And there, for the first time in European history, a king would be forced to negotiate his power with his own subjects. The meeting place was Runnymede, a broad, low meadow where the River Thames slowed and widened, its banks soft with grass and mud. It was chosen precisely because it offered no advantage. No walls to shelter behind, no hall to dominate or intimidate, just open ground beneath a summer sky where every movement could be seen and every word carried. Tents dotted the field, horses stamped and snorted. Armed men stood watch at careful distances, hands never far from their swords. On one side of the sea of tents stood King John with his clerks, bishops, and counselors. On the other side, the barons, many of them men who had once sworn loyalty to John. The air was heavy with distrust. No one there believed peace was guaranteed. Between the two camps lay parchment, carefully written, meticulously argued, and fiercely guarded. The barons' demands were read aloud, clause by clause, stripped of ornament. These were not lofty ideals. They were protections. No man imprisoned without lawful judgment. No lands seized without due process. No taxes imposed without common consent. Justice not delayed or denied. Each clause answered a wound. Each line drew a boundary. John objected, stalled, bargained, And then came the most dangerous demand of all. A provision that said if the king broke these promises, the barons could lawfully compel him to obey, by force if necessary. No English king had ever been asked to accept such a limit. No king had ever agreed. On June 15th, 1215, John pressed his royal seal onto the parchment. The moment was quiet, no cheers, no celebration. Those gathered understood how fragile this moment was. The document was called the Charter, sometimes referred to as the Charter of Liberties by the barons. Years later, it would earn the name Magna Carta, meaning Great Charter because of the greatness the charter contained. The original charter did not create democracy nor promise equality, but it did something unprecedented. It placed the king as subject to the law and outlined the unalienable rights of English subjects. It reiterated and officially documented that ancient story of natural rights that had guided the people's law and customs for centuries. In that open meadow, with no throne in sight, power was restrained, not by conquest, but by the power of a story. And that story, that document, would outlive every man standing there. When the Magna Carta was sealed at Runnymede, no one standing in that meadow imagined its afterlife. And yet, across centuries, its core idea proved stubbornly alive. That power must be restrained by law. Again and again, when rulers grew too strong, people reached back to the Magna Carta, not always for its exact words, but for its spirit. Kings might come and go, but the principle endured. Even the highest office must answer to something older than itself. That idea crossed the Atlantic with the Mayflower Pilgrims, infusing the story of individual rights into their own governing document, the Mayflower Compact. In the American colonies, the Magna Carta was not treated as a medieval relic, but as a living inheritance. Colonial leaders quoted it when protesting arbitrary taxation, unlawful searches, and imprisonment without trial. American colonists who had thoroughly soaked in this ancestral story of natural-born rights expected King George to behave according to the customs of law established centuries ago. Feeling that the king had committed the crime of abusing his power, Americans felt it their right, by virtue of the Magna Carta, to check that power. When no course correction was in sight, Americans rightfully sought to break their allegiance to a king who they believed behaved above the law. After gaining independence, many of the same principles outlined in the Magna Carta were carefully woven into the fabric of a new government, finding a home in the United States Constitution and later the United States Bill of Rights. Ideas that are foundational to American life trace their lineage directly back to the meadows of Runnymede. The men who drafted the Constitution did not copy the Magna Carta line by line, but they shared its conviction that liberty survives only when power is divided, limited, and accountable. In that sense, the Magna Carta's greatest legacy is not a document. It is a story about a promise forced from a reluctant medieval king in the middle of a meadow, and how centuries later, the principles in that document became foundational to placing checks and balances on power, protecting from the evils of tyranny and promoting unalienable rights. It may have taken centuries to evolve, but it is the story of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which we still hold dear like our ancestors of old. In so many ways, we as Americans are standing on the shoulders of giants. Though our country may be young compared to the old world, our foundation is built on ancient laws and customs that date back to the 11th century and beyond. Our roots are planted deep. We have a long and an illustrious history of people who loved and believed in this story so much that they were willing to put their homes, their careers, their reputations, and their lives on the line to defend it throughout generations of time. Kings and despots and those who threaten to usurp and abuse power will always be among us. That's just a reality of mortal life. Our job is to continue to tell this story of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness to each other and to future generations so that we may always have the courage to believe in it and defend it. May we hone some of that pluck, that self-reliance, that dogged determination, and emotional resilience that has historically embodied the American spirit. The more educated, resilient, and self-reliant we are as individuals, the better equipped we'll be to support and lift those around us, like our neighbors, our friends, our communities. May we keep that perseverant, indomitable spirit alive as we grapple with the challenges facing us today. What story are we going to love and believe in? What kind of story are we going to live? I sincerely hope we choose to tell the story that brought throngs of people to our shores over the last 200 years. The story of second chances. The story of dreams and aspirations. The story of freedom from oppression and tyranny. The story of opportunity to express oneself and to prosper. The freedom to build, innovate, explore, and improve the human condition. This story will help us overcome, to find solutions, and to remember. We must remember where we came from, how far we've come, and think deeply about how we want to leave the world for generations to come. It's our turn to be the giants for future posterity. Thank you for allowing me to share this story with you today. Hopefully you found it worthy of some space in your story reservoir. We invite you to join us next time for another great story. But for now, goodbye.